Thank you. We've talked over the last few days, we've talked about turns in academic research, and one of the very big turns has been big data. I don't know if you've heard about that. That hit social sciences about 5-10 years ago. And we're able to do things, I'm just waiting for PowerPoint to open. We are able to do things now with data that we weren't able to do before because of statistical power. The result of which social sciences in particular have been transformed by access to big data, but in particular by emphasis on using big data. That means getting lots and lots of data to understand how the world operates. And you can ask really, really interesting questions. And if you use that data down to a micro level, it's amazing what you can establish and work out. Before big data came along, there was always a big data tool, and that was the census. And we've relied on the census for decades. The quality of the census, as John pointed out, is variable. It depends on what you ask and how you use it, but we cannot pretend, whatever your opinion about statistical data is, we can't pretend that the census is not important. It impacts on our life every day. Decisions are made, short-term, medium-term and long-term decisions are made about policy settings, about funding, about aged care, about what languages are broadcast on SBS, what days they're shown, and how much time they get. So I can predict already that the place of SBS, of Italian programming on SBS, is going to show a rapid decline in the next few years. And that's because SBS relies on the census data results. And that there is a high turnover in SBS of languages that disappear and are replaced by new groups based on census results. So, and of course there's lots I can say, but I'm just going to give you a really general overview of what being Italian is like. We have a number of useful data sets. We have country of birth from 1911. We have country of birth of parents for a period, then it stopped because they were trying to save money, despite the desperate protestations by linguists and social scientists. Please keep asking people where their parents are born. So we have a gap between 1996 and 2016. Eventually the statisticians at the ABS realised that we needed that data. We have language used at home. It's a bit of a tricky question, as you'll see, and we have ancestry, again, which was introduced and then disappeared for a long time and has been reintroduced, thank goodness. And all of these construct a different part of the picture of Italianness, and none are absolutely definitive, obviously. So we can map immigration from Italy from 1947 to 2017. And we usually talk about 1951 being a critical point. That was when the agreement between Italy and Australia was signed. But you can actually see there was a rapid trajectory up even before the agreement was signed. It meant that people were coming unassisted. They were paying their own way. And the big peak was in, I think, 55. And at that point, you can see over 30,000 Italians arrived. That was 1/4 of the national intake at that time, which is quite an extraordinary proportion. And then you can see that it dropped precipitously in the early 70s. Italy's economic boom meant there was no longer a driver for people. And then all of a sudden, after 2007, 2008, financial issues, we have dramatic increases in the number of people arriving on temporary visas. Although it's important to point out that it's dropping, that they're not staying. Things have got better in Italy. Young Italians have discovered that life in Australia is a little bit more complicated and particularly more expensive than they imagined. And if you look, you can see this is just a closer snapshot. This is actually based not on the census data but on migration data. But you can see what's happening. But what's surprising is that we have many 5,000 to 6,000 Italian students who are here as international students. And that's an incredible number considering the cost of coming to Australia, both in terms of paying as a fee payer if you don't have a scholarship, or the simple cost of living here, which is a big downer. And if I were to advise an Italian, I'd say to them, go to Germany, it's cheaper, it's closer, you get free education. All right, so the firstborn, the Italy-born generation, you can see what happened. It peaked in 1971. There are almost 300,000 Italian born in Australia, which is a massive number. And of course, there was always a flow in both directions. People didn't necessarily stay. People often wanted to just come for a few years, make money, and then go back. So there was movement back and forth, but you can see that the peak is long past and is dropping. We're about 60% off the peak. And what you can see here in particular is the ageing profile of the Italy-born cohort. And you can see that there are the largest number of young Italians born in Italy was, we only have data from 1986, in 1986, and you can see all of a sudden it drops completely predictably, and there's a resurgence in 2016. And we're noticing this in schools and universities. We have kids who are partly educated, Italian-born, partly educated in Italy, who are moving with their families to Australia, as well as university students, etc., all those international fee payers. But what you can see is the middle cohort is disappearing, and what we're having is an expansion of the oldest generation, 60 plus, because this generation is obviously aging and moving in, and we're having rapid exiting. I don't know what the word, rapid exiting from the scene of people who are older at that time. So we have a radically different age profile, and you can see it most graphically over there. And it has incredible consequences. The Italian-born, that cohort of Italian-born, the average age now is 65. 65. The average Australian, I think, is about 35. So there is a 30-year gap between the average Italian-born and the average Australian. So it's a massive transformation. They're no longer, the Italian-born are no longer young, and this is obviously this has consequences for planning, particularly in terms of healthcare and in age services, obviously. Particularly implications also for language services. One of the problems is, of course, that people who are Italian-born don't necessarily speak Italian sufficiently well or adequately well to be able to communicate to a certified Italian translator. What often happens is interpreters work to the best of their ability, often with their own knowledge of a local dialect or variety, to communicate. It works often, but it doesn't always work. And you can see there's our little jump in 2016. I just thought people would be interested to see, because Australia is a federal state, and if you're not from Australia, just to see that actually the Italian migration is really heavily skewed towards Melbourne. Of all the cities and states, this is the top line. That's Victoria. They came here because Victoria had cheap electricity, which attracted industry, which needed workers, which meant that there was jobs for people with low skills. They actually preferred them not to speak English. English speakers were too much trouble. English speakers got organised and joined unions. So, for instance, there's a long tradition of union organisers being Scottish. So those of us who are old enough to remember, union organisers that we heard on television and radio often spoke with Scottish accents. And John's laughing because it's true. And it's genuinely the case. They did not want English speakers because they were English speakers were too problematic. But you can see Victoria has always been the primary destination for Italians because of that reason. And New South Wales, which has the largest population overall, is the second. And you can see what's happening is the decline is greatest in Victoria because of that massive migration in the 50s and 60s. It's not unpredictable that the decline over time is going to be the greatest there. So when we look at the second generation, this is really quite interesting, and you're starting, and this is just at the highest level. You can see that we had second generation data. We don't have the ancestry of the parents, location of birth, but you can see that by 2016, the second generation, which is obviously now still in an increase, and that's because many of the people, while the average age of people who are 65 of Italians is 65, there are still many people who came here as children, as babies, as young infants, and they're having children in the intervening period. And you can see that what's happened is the second generation is still increasing, the first generation is disappearing. But what's particularly interesting is when you dig down just a little bit, is you see the difference between which parent is marrying who. And so you have about 2/3 marry within the community, both parents are Italian, but it's really striking that the proportion of Italian males marrying out is much, much greater than the proportion of Italian females marrying out. So these are presumably marrying the other women who don't match are presumably marrying into the Italian community. Some other communities are obviously taking the slack across the gender, and we've got some general data to give you an idea, but there is clearly a different dynamic across genders. If we look at languages, the problem is here the questions weren't the same. So when we present this data, which is quite commonly presented, and a lot of you, a number of papers here used language data at various points. Unfortunately, the questions aren't the same. We just have to assume that they're the best that we have, and we are able to use them. But from 1986, does the person speak a language other than English at home? And you're only allowed to mark one box. Which is a problem because for many of us, of course, we grow up speaking in families where dialect or Italian or multiple languages are spoken. And one of the other problems is, of course, that the figures that we have are for Italian. So if you put down Sicilian, you're automatically shunted into Italian. So it's actually masking the linguistic diversity that we have within the community. And what's happened, very clearly, Italian was for decades the largest ethnic community language in Australia for a long, long time, and you can see it's transformed. It's now fifth. It's actually dropped very fast, and it will continue to drop very fast because we have massive in-migration. Chinese, Mandarin has taken off, but Cantonese and other languages, Arabic, have pipped us now. And languages like German, surprisingly, are remarkably stable. Someone was talking the other day about how quickly the Germans assimilated. They did, but all of a sudden they've stopped disappearing into the Anglo-Saxon world. When we look at Italian spoken at home, this here gives you an idea. Over time, you can see that of those speaking Italian at home, half were born in Italy, 43% were born in Australia, and 6.5% were born elsewhere. This could be Egypt. We have a particularly large migration from Egypt, from Alexandria, who were forced out by Nasser in the 1950s, and from other places. And if we look at age group, this is something of particular interest to me, obviously, as a linguist and as a language teacher. You can see the age profile that what we've had is a massive drop in young speakers, partly through aging, but partly also because have we been able to pass the language on to new generations. The decline has slowed here just a little bit, partly because we have this arrival in the last 10 years, but you can see the rapid aging profile of who's speaking Italian. It's undeniable. And if you look at state, Victoria again, and again the decline is greatest there because we have the largest and the oldest community there. And if we look at language shift from first to second generation, the first generation, those born in Italy, there's been a very gradual increase in the proportion of people who speak English at home. It's actually fairly stable over this period of time, 30 years. And then we don't have data here, unfortunately, but what's happened is, surprisingly, we've had a bit of stabilisation in the second generation, the younger Italians now. And that, we think, is probably due to the arrival of these young Italians and their children fitting in. And then we have, you can see across the family structure has a critical effect on whether people continue to speak their language. And both parents born in Italy, the proportion of people shifting has dropped slightly because of this young wave of people bringing children or having children here. And then otherwise it's actually fairly stable, and good news is there's been a bit of a drop in the second generation, and we think it's possibly due to these people arriving here and having young children here. But the most important thing for us, we think now, is that we're moving from Italian born, Italian language to Italian ancestry. So this is something from 1986 and 2001. And it's quite restrictive, so you can't say all the things that you come from because I suppose the permutations are impossible. Some are listed there already: English, Irish, Scottish, Italian, German, Chinese, and Australian, and then you can add as well. So what we've noted is actually positively, there's a very big increase in the number of people who claim Italian ancestry, and what's particularly striking is this massive leap between 2001 and 2006. all of a sudden it became fashionable amongst young people to reclaim their Italian identity. Something happened in this period of time. It continues to increase, not so dramatically, but something is worth investigating in that time frame. But what's particularly interesting is the dichotomy between Italian only and being able to label yourself with multiple labels. And you will see that Italian only is very strong still, very, very strong. Regardless of what your actual genetic makeup is, you're allowed to report yourself in whatever way you like. So you may only have one parent who's Italian, but you may say that's sufficient for me to call myself Italian. But for the others, you can see that Italian Australian is the second or third largest category. But what's really interesting is that discovering who Italians are mixing with, they're mixing with Anglo-Saxons, English. We assumed that we thought, our thinking would be that they would mix most likely with the Irish because of the religious connection. That would have been an obvious predictor, but that's not the case. So religion isn't as big a predictor as we thought, because also we're getting quite substantial mixing with the Greek community. That, we think, most likely comes from the fact that Catholic schools have traditionally always accepted a large number of Greek Australians. So there is interethnic mixing in that particular category. But even with the Germans, you can see that it's a relatively high number. And we have this weird thing here that we're going to show you about all of a sudden our Italian-Scottish disappeared. What happened there? Well, they didn't. They relabeled themselves and they now prefer to be identified as Scottish Italian as opposed to Italian Scottish. And the only reason we can explain this is that the two census periods coincides with before and after the Scottish referendum on devolution. So all of a sudden there is this incredible awareness of being Scottish because the referendum in Scotland was very, very widely reported, and all of a sudden it's okay to be Scottish over Italian. But you can see that people quite flexible in the identities that they're willing to identify with. Now, what are the implications for language maintenance and language teaching? Me and Yvette and I did a big study a few years ago that we published in 2015, looking at the teaching of Italian in schools and trying to understand what the impact was. There are many different things we looked at, but one of the things that we looked at was the potential relationship between language maintenance and language teaching. Now, Italians made a fateful and really important decision in the 1980s to open out Italian language teaching to everybody. They did not want to restrict it to the Italian community. This was a very fateful decision, and it's had incredibly positive effects for the Italian-Australian community here. They are undoubtedly the most integrated, most positively viewed non-Anglo-Saxon, non-Anglo-Celtic community in the country. Largely, the food has been an important factor. It's absolutely true. When you survey Australians about what are the best aspects of multiculturalism, 95% respond food, and Italian food is clearly the first amongst lesser equals. Okay, so what we did was we compared the language maintenance in 2011 and 2016. We looked at young speakers under the age of 14. The Greek community has always been an important comparator for Italians, and we can see that they've done a better job. The community is smaller, it's large. Melbourne is supposed to be the second largest Greek-speaking city in the world. They've done a better job at maintaining language than the Italians have in both periods. But what's really striking is how little Greek is taught in the primary school system as opposed to the Italian. But what they do is they have large numbers in community language schools, often very closely intertwined with the religious structures as well. So language teaching hasn't been supporting language maintenance, and the reason being is that the language teaching that we do is for everybody. And when it's for everybody, you start at the start. So it's been doing wonderful work in terms of changing attitudes, but it can't in itself, and it's logical, it can't support language maintenance in the way that the efforts in the Greek community, which are very differently structured, have. So in summary, just bringing these things together, you can see that the Italian-born, the numbers are declining, the numbers of people speaking Italian are declining, and will continue to do so because of the ageing profile. We may have some slowdown depending on the numbers of Italians who arrive in new generations. But what's absolutely undeniable is the dramatic increase in people who are willing and happy to identify themselves partly or completely as Italian by ancestry. So obviously none of the available census measures do justice to Italianness, but they do help us to track its changing nature, at least as a statistical construct, and I think you can say a lot more about what the stats tell us. It's obviously a case of changes in the questions don't help, but, and my authors have said, ancestry as identification, possibly the most interesting marker. I think I'd be stronger than that and say actually what we've got here in Australia very clearly is we're having a shift to Italian as heritage, and those figures are going to continue to increase for decades to come. Thank you very much.